All right. So, Mr. Dan Hunt, again, one of our speaker chairs for the club, has done a great job with arranging a variety of speakers. Today, he's going to be introducing Kevin Roche. And Dan, if you want to just unmute yourself and get started, that'd be great.
Thank you, Madam President. Today is December 1st, 2020, and this is the weekly meeting of the Edina Morningside Rotary Club. Our speaker today is Kevin Roche. Kevin is the editor of the website, The Healthy Skeptic, which normally provides general information about healthcare and the health system, but since last spring has concentrated on coronavirus research and government response to the virus. Kevin received his law degree and an MBA from the University of Minnesota. He worked as a law clerk for federal judge Earl Larson at the Minnesota Attorney General's office and at the law firm of Lindquist and Benham. He was assistant general counsel at Park Nicollet Medical Center and American Med Centers before becoming general counsel of United Health Group, a position he held during the company's rapid growth and multiple acquisitions. Kevin then founded and ran the Nginx, now Optum Insight division of United Health. After leaving United Health, he was an investor, legal and business advisor, and consultant in the healthcare field, including as a principal in Vita Advisors LLC, as a senior consultant for Triple Tree, and as a founder of Roche Consulting. He has served on the boards of many companies, including Virtual Radiologics, Oak Street Health, Pursuit Vascular, and Infomedics. Kevin lives in Minneapolis with his wife and 3 children. There'll be a Q&A when he is done. Please post your questions to the chat. Kevin, the broadband is all yours.
So number one, obviously, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all and share information. I'll try to get through this quickly so I can answer questions that people may have. Basically, this is divided into 3 parts. One is kind of at the micro or individual human level. One is kind of at the population level. And then one is about the responses to the epidemic. So at the micro level, just very basically, what is a coronavirus? Viruses are organisms that actually for a long time scientists have debated whether or not they're actually living. They basically do one thing, and that's replicate. And the way they do that is typically by getting into a cell, taking over the machinery inside the cell that's used to make proteins and other biochemicals, and using that machinery to replicate, to create new virus that then goes out of the cell and infects additional cells. Coronaviruses are called that. Now I have a picture in a minute here because they have a surface that's coated with spikes that look like a crown. These are very common viruses. We all encounter them. We've all likely been infected by seasonal coronaviruses. It's one of the virus families that is responsible for colds. And this has some potential significance. Typically, if you are infected by a seasonal coronavirus, you would develop some kind of an adaptive immune response. You can go to the next slide. So, do I need to advance it?
No, I advanced it.
Oh, you did. Okay, sorry. I can't see the.
Yeah,
sorry about that. Okay, so what is COVID-19? It's a new strain of coronavirus, which apparently emerged in China, we believe, sometime in 2019. It likely developed in an animal host and jumped or was able to infect humans as well. This is actually the 3rd recent coronavirus strain to jump to humans and to be more lethal than seasonal coronaviruses. Why is this particular strain more dangerous to humans? Some of the differences are it uses a different human cell receptor, one that's very common. It appears to have the ability to have stronger binding to that receptor, which facilitates its entry into a cell. And it also appears to have the capability to evade our immune defenses more completely than some of the earlier strains. So the next slide is a picture of a coronavirus. This is from a scanning electron microscope. And you can see the spikes on the surface, and down at the bottom, you can see the picture of what this spike looks like. That spike is what is used to find and attach to the receptor on a human cell. Next slide. So one thing I try to spend a little time on is thinking about some very basic kind of concepts and words that we hear. And I think it's important to understand that there's usually a lot of complexity underneath those terms. So even something as basic as, what does it mean to be infected? We all might be exposed to various pathogens. We breathe them in, they land on our skin. Being infected would typically mean that in some way the pathogen is actually affecting you adversely. This coronavirus is a respiratory virus, which means it primarily is inhaled. There is some suggestion that it may be able to come in through the eyes or other sources. Once you are exposed, your body has a variety of defenses, particularly in the upper respiratory tract, that are designed to clear pathogens, allergens, other potentially dangerous substances. And those defenses might be able to clear the pathogen before it even has an opportunity to enter into cells or into a significant number of cells. If this virus does get into the upper respiratory tract and is able to enter into cells, it typically does that through something that's called the ACE receptor, which is a very common receptor. So it's a pretty easy target. Once it's inside a cell, the virus begins that replication process, and then we'll be able to create large numbers of additional virus particles, which begin spreading in the body and potentially outside the body. One of the things that there is a lot of uncertainty about is how many virus particles does it typically take to create an infection. And that dose actually probably varies pretty widely depending on a person's health status, immune system status, and other factors. Next slide. This is just a diagram I found, kind of gives you a sense of what the respiratory tract looks like. One thing, if you look at the upper respiratory tract, our nose, our mouth, sinus cavities, all of these tissues have various immune cell components in them. So things like antibodies, T cells, other components of the immune system are found not just in the blood, but in a variety of other tissues, including mucosal tissues. And so those cells are capable of mounting a defense. If the virus manages to get into the lower respiratory tract, down into the lungs, that's where it can begin to do more significant damage, both in terms of breathing, but also in terms of its ability to spread. Next slide. So this is another pretty basic concept that I think is important to think about, which is what does it mean for someone to be infectious? I mentioned that when people get infected and the virus begins replicating, at some point, those virus particles that are released can end up back in the respiratory tract and can be exhaled. The viral load, the number of virus particles that are being exhaled, again, can be highly variable. And there is a pretty strong suggestion that some people are relatively high shedders and are probably responsible for a disproportionate percentage of transmission. Shedding occurs in droplets. There was some uncertainty early on whether it also could occur in smaller airborne particles called aerosols. That would be important because these smaller particles actually have the ability to stay aloft for an extended period of time and to carry viable virus for an extended period of time. There have been a number of studies done trying to ascertain how long the virus can survive. Those come to different conclusions, but it does appear that depending on the circumstances, the virus has the capability to remain viable, that is capable of creating an infection for at least a number of hours. People have also obviously done a lot of work on trying to understand where and how transmission occurs. Do people who are asymptomatic play a role? There's a lot still to be learned about exactly how that occurs. This issue of who is infectious is probably, in terms of controlling an epidemic, the most important thing to understand, because these are the people who are capable of infecting other people. So the whole point of testing and isolation is to try and identify these people and limit how often they can spread. The next slide. When your body is exposed and when it becomes infected, it's a very complex interaction, as it always is with a pathogen. People have kind of general immune responses, which are capable of dealing with pathogens. As I mentioned, there is a line of research that suggests that potentially people who have been infected with a seasonal coronavirus have lingering either antibody or T-cell defenses that may actually either limit their ability to be infected by this strain of coronavirus or may mean that they have less severe disease. There's a wide range of infection and disease severity. Almost all cases are asymptomatic and mild, but there are a number of severe cases, and those severe cases are often caused by an excessive immune response. One of the things the immune system tries to do when it thinks the body's under attack by a pathogen, it will actually kill cells that it believes the virus is in. You can imagine if you get too much of that, that actually is one of the leading causes of really severe disease and death, is that immune overreaction. Next slide. So the human immune system is, to say it's complex is kind of an understatement. Scientists are still really trying to understand all of the components, how they all interact, how they interact with the environment. And actually, one good thing that's come out of this epidemic is there's a lot of general knowledge that's being gained. The current company that I'm co-founder of works in cell and gene therapy, which is directly tied to the immune system, and trying to understand how those therapies work, given the complexity of the immune system, is very difficult. So I have a pretty good appreciation for how complex this system is. The basic response to an acute infection when you first get infected is that the body tries to figure out how it can either destroy the pathogen or, as I mentioned before, cells that are infected with it. There are two primary components of the immune system. There are other cells that also play important roles, but the one is B cells. They're called B cells because they develop in the bone marrow. These are cells that one of their primary roles is to produce antibodies. Antibodies are capable of disabling the virus either by preventing it from entering a cell, preventing it from replicating. The second one is T cells. They're called T cells because they develop in the thymus. T cells play kind of two major roles. One is to kind of coordinate the defense, signal other parts of the immune system, but some T cells also have the capability to directly disable or destroy either the virus or cells that the virus is in. And then the body typically develops what's called adaptive immunity as a result of fighting an acute infection. So if you go to the next couple of slides, the next slide just kind of shows you a general timeline of how various components of the adaptive immune system typically develop over the course of an infection. One of the things that there is a lot of research on right now is how strong and how durable is the adaptive immune response. People are obviously concerned about the possibility of reinfection. They're also trying to gain knowledge that will aid in the development of vaccines. And if the next slide is just another pictorial that gives you a sense of some of the components of the immune system. So the next slide, just kind of a continuation of the notion of adaptive immunity. Again, like most things, this is a very complex thing to understand. And one thing I always say to people is having adaptive immunity, and this applies to vaccine-enabled adaptive immunity as well. It's not like some physical barrier that's going to keep you from being exposed. It's more like a rapid reaction force inside the body that is capable of very quickly responding to the presence of a pathogen that's been encountered before, and hopefully clearing that pathogen very quickly, hopefully before it ever gets into cells and begins replicating. And again, this adaptive immunity is also primarily composed of B cells and T cells. These cells have a memory of the pathogen. That memory is created by recognizing certain sequences in this case, in the viral genome. Typically, those sequences that are being recognized are from parts of the virus that are particularly dangerous, like the receptor binding area, the spike area in this particular pathogen. There is some level typically of circulating antibodies that can recognize and neutralize a pathogen. But more importantly, there is a population of what are called memory B cells and memory T cells that can be signaled and can very quickly produce additional antibodies, can multiply and be used to fight the pathogen. And as I mentioned before, these immune system components exist not only in the blood, but in peripheral tissues like mucosal ones. And in fact, if you've been exposed and you have adaptive immunity and you're re-exposed, the antibodies and T cells in your upper respiratory tract are most likely to be what comes into play to try and defend against that reinfection. Okay, so now moving on to kind of the macro level, the population level. An epidemic is just defined as a disease outbreak of a certain size. Pandemic is typically one that's in multiple countries. Public health agencies are supposedly monitoring for early detection of epidemics. That's obviously dependent on fast and accurate reporting by countries. And in this case, I think we know, and in the last just day or so, we've gotten more information. China was not very forthcoming. The World Health Organization apparently facilitated their lack of transparency about what was going on. And that probably hindered everybody in dealing with this epidemic as quickly as it could have been dealt with. An epidemic typically is deemed to end when cases or deaths drop below a certain level. Many pathogens that were epidemic then become what's referred to as endemic, meaning they exist at some background level. There's typically some relatively low number of cases that are ongoing, and there may be occasional outbreaks. Influenza definitely falls into that category. Next slide. So one thing in terms of managing an epidemic that people are obviously very interested in is what's the typical shape and course. Many decades ago, people developed the first kind of models about an epidemic, these SEIR models, susceptible, exposed, infected, recovered. There are a number of variations of those models. The original models tend to be inadequately sophisticated in terms of their representation of the population or the dynamics of spread. If you're building any model, the most critical part is to have an accurate schematic of the relationships that you're trying to model. And then you try to turn those relationships into formulas that are driven by certain parameters, and you drive the model through time. I am most familiar in healthcare. We build a lot of models that have a lot of past data to work off of. At Ingenix, we were the first people building models about physician practice patterns. And so we could take a lot of past data and be able to kind of identify what kind of physicians would handle what kind of patients in a certain way, and then use that to kind of help physicians practice in what we thought were more effective ways. With these epidemics, you often don't have that past data. And so you're doing a lot of guessing about what the parameters look like. And one of the reasons the modeling's been so bad in this epidemic is because we don't have that past data. We're kind of having to learn on the fly. And that's been an issue at times when people rely on them. If you go to the next slide, this is just my simplistic kind of schematic. Pretty similar to some other ones that people do. You start with a population. A certain percent of the population is probably never going to get exposed. Out of those that are exposed, A certain percent of them clear the virus very quickly and never actually become infectious. A larger percent become infected and infectious. Some have asymptomatic or mild disease. Some develop more severe illness. Some of those become obviously hospitalized. Some don't become hospitalized. And in this epidemic, one thing I've tried really hard to get data about, and it's hard to find, is we have a lot of elderly people with advanced directives. We have a lot of people who are being infected with pretty severe illness, but they don't end up in the hospital because of advanced directives, and they actually end up dying in their place of residence, whether it's a private home or a nursing home. But this kind of just gives you a sense of what a schematic might look like. Next slide. So what have we learned so far about what some of the characteristics of this epidemic are? A couple of things I think are pretty apparent is, one is there are extremely bifurcated outcomes, and I have some slides at the end that will show this graphically. It's the presence of severe disease is much more likely in the elderly than it is in younger people. And we have seen far more severe disease in congregate care kinds of settings than in the community. The epidemic has been front loaded, and by that I mean for whatever reason, and I suspect it must be related to the viral dose required, this virus has had an exceptional ability to target the most vulnerable first. It tends to get into the congregate care settings, and it does a lot of damage there because people are just very susceptible. The other thing that's very notable about this epidemic is just the huge number of cases that are completely asymptomatic or very mild. And that makes it hard to detect who has an infection. While it's pretty clear that asymptomatic people are less likely to transmit, they still can be a source of transmission. And the other thing it does is, when people start looking at numbers, if you don't know how many infections there really have been, your parameters about hospitalization rates and death rates are not likely to be very accurate. There is enormous variation across the population in terms of being susceptible to being infected, and in both to being infectious or your level of infectiousness. And those existing cross-reactive defenses to seasonal coronavirus may play a role in that. I mentioned that there's this issue that people continue to try and identify how much transmission is really due to asymptomatic cases. It's very apparent at this point that there is some seasonality / geographic component to the level of cases caused by this virus. I've read a large number of studies. People are trying very hard to kind of identify exactly what are these factors, and why and under certain conditions does transmission seem to occur more often. It's almost certainly a combination of the virus is more able to survive for a long period of time in certain conditions, appears to like lower temperatures, appears to like lower humidity, appears to like it when there's not a lot of sunlight or a lot of intense sunlight. Maybe due to human biochemical factors that change with the season. Vitamin D levels has been suggested as one, and it may be associated with human behavior changes that occur as the season change. Are people indoors more? So a lot of work, I think, yet to be done to really understand what's driving some of these patterns. Next slide. So how do you control or stop an epidemic? I think when you have a pathogen like this, that's this transmissible and infectious, the notion that you're actually going to stop it or completely suppress it is generally not possible. If you're an island country like New Zealand and you're willing to take the really extreme economic hit, and if you're willing to put your population in a position where they're very dependent on a vaccine that's effective being developed, you might be able to do it. In most of the developed world where there are pretty open borders and a large flow of people, it's hard to do. But transmission clearly can be slowed. Most mitigation measures are designed to slow that transmission, to match it to health resources, and obviously to provide some period of time while you're hoping to develop a vaccine. The thing that definitely will slow transmission is, some people call this herd immunity. I don't think people are animals, so I always refer to it as population immunity. And basically the idea there is that enough people have an adaptive immunity to slow transmission, and obviously a vaccine accelerates that adaptive immune development. And in the meantime, and we've definitely seen this, better kind of care guidelines and treatments can limit morbidity and mortality. But in general, I think we need to adapt to the fact that this virus is going to be around, probably going to be endemic. And in many ways, we're fortunate because if you took a true apples to apples comparison, this pathogen actually is not as lethal as the flu. And I think that'll become apparent once we have a vaccine. I think it'll result in pretty low levels of disease compared to the flu, for which we also have a vaccine. All right, so the next few slides are designed to show the progress of the epidemic as it moves through an unexposed population. And what the figures are designed to represent to some extent is the variability that you would find in any population. And that variability is demographic in terms of gender, age, people's income, other life circumstances. It's also highly variable in terms of people's health, the level of diseases that they have, the status of their immune system, including whether or not they may have some prior exposure to coronaviruses that will help them fend off the current strain. If you think about any population, what's important from an epidemic perspective is the level of contacts that these people have. Each contact with another person is a potential opportunity for transmission if one of the people is infected and infectious. People have done a fair amount of research to try and understand kind of levels of contact. Those tend to vary by age and other circumstances. And generally, younger people tend to have a much higher level of contacts socially, and the working age population obviously has significant work contacts. Population density of where a person lives can obviously play a role in this as well. If you live in a city, you're much more likely just in your daily activities to have a high number of contacts. And one thing that also can create some variability is actually the impact of seasonality. If you're thinking about the population of the United States, we've obviously seen geographic variability in these waves. So where these people live and what the potential impact of the seasonality factors are may also be relevant to how the epidemic moves. So at the start, you're assuming all of these people are susceptible to becoming infected, but you also should probably assume that there's a lot of variability in the number of contacts and potential exposures they have, and in the likelihood that they become infected. So now here we see a representation where 1 out of 10 people are infected. That's not a lot of people, probably not enough to really in any way significantly slow transmission. If you imagine each one of these people having whatever number of contacts they typically have with the other people in the population, there's a period of time, it appears to be probably roughly a week to 9 days, where if they are infected, they can be infectious and they could infect other people. And some of these people are likely going to be infectious when they're asymptomatic. So there definitely is a concern that they may not be aware that they have the potential to infect other people. Now, if we move on to the situation where we have 5 out of 10 people infected, you can see just by looking at the slide that the transmission opportunities for the virus are significantly diminished. If you assume that each one of these people that's kind of circled and that has become infected develops an adaptive immunity, then they are no longer targets for transmission. So if you imagine the virus looking around in this population and trying to figure out who can I hop to and infect, obviously the potential targets are significantly lower. And this is the phenomenon that causes eventual slowing of the transmission. And at some point, people start referring to population immunity. But if you think about it, it's really kind of a sliding scale, a gradient that's pretty continual throughout the epidemic of removing people from that susceptible bucket into the no longer susceptible bucket. And you see continual slowing of the epidemic throughout that process. The traditional notion of population immunity with a pathogen with this rough level of infectiousness would be that 70 to 80% of the population needs to be infected, and then you would see a truly low level of infection. More sophisticated modeling that takes some of those variability factors that I mentioned into account would suggest that it's possible that you see a very significant slowing of transmission at lower levels of infection. And I think that's one of the things we will kind of learn as this process goes on. So now I'd like to turn to the third area, which is kind of the government responses. The background to this, as I see it, is a few factors. One, unfortunately, from my perspective, we live in an era where there is intense politicization of everything. So all decisions that are made by government tend to be looked at through a political lens, and that can affect what those decisions are. Second thing is the presence of social media, which creates a very fast dissemination of information, but with very limited accuracy checks, and it tends to be very spur of the moment and very emotional. I have not personally been a significant user of social media. The blog posts tend to go out automatically, but I will tell you that I've actually begun to use Twitter a fair amount because I do find a lot of information there and links that are pretty accurate. So there can be some benefits from social media, but I also think it has some real downsides in terms of how people get their information. the traditional media, in my opinion, has not done a good job of presenting kind of rational, balanced information. It has clearly tended to be very hysteria focused. I think a lot of that is driven by rating seeking behavior. A recent study from the National Bureau of Economic Research found that in the US media, 91% of stories about coronavirus were predominantly negative. So that influences the kind of public perception of what's going on. And I think it influences it in a way that's not accurate. And the other thing that appears to have happened in our population is that there is among a large number of people what I would consider to be an excessive kind of safety risk aversion mindset, sort of almost a belief that risk can be removed, and a lack of ability to balance risk. The coronavirus epidemic is kind of very top of mind, and people are not as aware that the responses to that epidemic can also cause risk and harm to people. Other kinds of issues, we've had a lack of real data, especially early on, that would guide us in understanding what's really going on in the epidemic. And I, again, would note that I think China has been a real problem in that regard. And if we'd had more transparency earlier, people would have been more equipped to develop good responses. The initial modeling, I think, literally can only be described as horrible. It was based on, again, inaccurate data from China, which people should not have relied on, frankly. And it was based on a lack of innovative kind of thinking about how to really look at an epidemic. It was based on very traditional notions that turn out not to fit this epidemic particularly well. The other thing that we see among governments is kind of a herd mentality. Even early on, people looked at what China did and thought, well, their approach of kind of locking everybody down very extremely is the way to deal with this. There was another paper that was put out by a group trying to look at why governments took the actions that they took. And they found that the leading factor associated with a government taking a particular action, a stay-at-home order or closing businesses, was what their neighboring countries were doing. So very clearly, politicians were looking around and kind of saying, well, everybody's doing this, so I'm going to do it. And I think that's exacerbated by the usual political fear of being accused of not doing something or not doing enough. And frankly, a lack of kind of hubris around the limits of human interaction and human ability to necessarily affect everything. There are circumstances in which sometimes there really may not be much that you can do. The result of this, in my opinion, has been, especially early on, and we continue to see this now, what I consider to be irrational and unbalanced responses with the sole aim of attempting to suppress the spread of the virus and a lack of consideration of the effects of those actions that are taken. The effects may be unintended, but they're well known. It's well known, for example, that when economic activity is suppressed and people lose jobs, that there are health and social consequences that follow from that. There's a significant body of research showing those impacts. And globally and in the United States, there's a growing body of research about the damage that what is broadly referred to as lockdowns has caused. And that damage is not just economic, it's social, it's educational, it's health. The United Nations is currently estimating that as many as 275 million additional people will die of starvation and disease in the next few years because of the actions that have been taken around the epidemic. We've seen in this country a number of studies suggesting that what we're doing to children in terms of their educational opportunity will have lasting effects on the income that they generate throughout their lives and even have health impacts. And again, there's a significant body of research from before this epidemic to support those kinds of harms. And the damage that's caused by some of these responses will last much longer than the epidemic, and I believe in total will cause far more harm than we will endure from the virus itself. And we will see that in health in particular, children who miss vaccinations, people who don't get care for serious heart disease, diabetes, hypertension. We will see the consequences of that for an extended period of time. Some of the responses, again, while well-intended, have definitely had some consequences that are not necessarily good. There's been a widespread belief that if you can just test constantly, test as many people as frequently as possible, that will allow you to do sufficient kind of isolation of people who are infected and contact tracing of people who they may have infected. And at least in the United States, that really has not worked well. Here in the state of Minnesota, the state has basically acknowledged that at this point, its contact tracing efforts have not been adequate and really are probably overwhelmed. Part of that is because PCR testing, which is the most common test to identify presence of the virus, that testing it can be set at different thresholds relating to its accuracy. If you set the thresholds too high, you are only picking up virus fragments, not virus that's actually viable, capable of being transmitted. And we in Minnesota are using high thresholds. So that means that we're not able to focus on people who are actually sick and infectious in terms of either isolation policies or contact tracing. We also have not done a particularly good job of trying to understand what's the true prevalence of infection rate in the population. To do that, you need antibody testing is the most common way of doing that. That's probably inadequate, both due to assay issues, but also due to the fact that when you're talking about adaptive immunity, what's really important is the presence of memory T and B cells. And so you need to be able to test for those. But in any event, everybody believes that the actual level of infection is a multiple of reported cases, but we don't have a really good idea of what that prevalence is. And again, that's important if you think back to those charts, how many people are kind of actually out of that pool that can be infected. Data transparency, I think, has been an issue everywhere. There are a number of data items that would be very important to see that we don't see, and either governments have them and aren't reporting them, or they're not collecting them, which is even harder to understand. And I'll just mention a couple. If you think about hospitalizations, the research that's been done suggests that a number of hospitalizations that are attributed to coronavirus are actually people who were admitted for another reason and happen to test positive. They don't end up with any symptoms. They aren't actually treated for coronavirus, but they're listed as a coronavirus hospitalization. And the research has showed that as many as 15 to 30% of all coronavirus hospitalizations actually fall in that category. Well, it'd be important for the public to know that and to know the true number of people who are actually being hospitalized because of coronavirus illness. The diagnosis and attribution of death to coronavirus is unprecedented. The CDC issued special guidance, which has been picked up and enhanced even in some states. We are saying people died because of coronavirus if they had any positive test, in some cases, even 60 days or longer before they died. And whether or not really coronavirus had anything to do with their death. Nationally, there are over 10,000 deaths listed as coronavirus deaths that the real cause of death was an accident, poisoning, homicides, suicides, and things like that, where clearly coronavirus had nothing to do with the people dying, but they were positive at some point for coronavirus. So that has given a very exaggerated picture of the number of deaths that are actually occurring from coronavirus. And when I talk about comparing flu to coronavirus, this is one of the things I mean. If we attributed death to flu the same way we do to coronavirus, we would have a far higher level of flu deaths. School closures, in my personal opinion, have been a complete disaster. Every study shows that for most children, distance learning is a failure and is inadequate. It's frustrating to children. It results in them having screen time that medically they are advised to avoid. And the impact is clearly the worst on minority and low income children. Many of those have simply dropped out of the system. And we have seen articles and reports of that here in Minnesota. The business shutdowns, obviously the impact on employment, but also on a business owner's kind of life dreams and their life work is very significant. And I've listed a couple of other typical responses here. But the last point is the one that disturbs me the most, which is instead of over an epidemic that's now lasted for 9 months, 10 months or longer, instead of using a typical democratic approach to make decisions, we are being governed by one person rule, not just in Minnesota, but in most states. That is not democratic, and it is not necessary. Our governor, other governors may not like the opinions of their legislative bodies, but that's the whole point of a democracy. And it results in decisions that may be compromises, but that reflect more truly the will of the people. And beyond that, they're likely to be better decisions, because what we're seeing right now in our own state, we see this. We see people who are very entrenched with a small body of people that they talk to, a small body of opinions that they consider, and an approach that's more designed to justifying decisions that have been made than truly trying to come to the best decisions that consider a wide variety of perspectives, of data. And so I have been very concerned that not only has that happened, but it continues to go on for as long as it has. So what's next? I think everybody's probably a little leery of trying to predict what might happen here. There clearly is a lot of seasonality and geographic variability, probably linked to certain meteorological factors like temperature, relative humidity, amount and intensity of sunshine. there appears to be some niche that is extremely favorable for the virus to both thrive and to be transmitted. As far as I can tell from the research, that is likely due to some effect around the lipid envelope that encapsulates the virus and the stability of that envelope. It appears to like lower temperatures, lower humidity, less sunshine. Some of that seasonality may be due to human biochemistry. We have higher vitamin D levels when we get lots of sunshine. Some of it may be due to human behavior. We are indoors more typically when it's colder or when it's very hot. But there is clearly some effect of these factors on transmission and on case spread. What is the true prevalence in the United States? And how close are we to significantly slowing transmission just because of that prevalence? The current kind of research suggests that there are places where prevalence is 20 or 30%. The most recent estimate in Minnesota, for example, is that we probably have at least 6 times as many people who have been infected as are reported. That would be about 2 million Minnesotans, or approaching 35 to 40% of our population. That would significantly slow transmission, and I believe it's why the current wave was less intense in the metro area, where it was intense in the spring, and why it now has clearly begun to decline. One thing you always have to be worried about with these respiratory viruses is the possibility of mutations, especially mutations that either make the virus more transmissible or more lethal. We've been fortunate so far that while there appear to be some mutations that have become widespread, they don't necessarily at this point appear to be making the virus much more dangerous. But that's obviously something we have to keep an eye on. Vaccines obviously are here right around the corner from being delivered. My only concern about vaccines is that people have a good understanding that typically vaccines have a certain level of effectiveness, but it's not necessarily 100%. And if you think about the influenza vaccine, there's an example where from year to year, it has a high level of effectiveness, but it's not 100%. And that's because there can be different strains. Vaccines work differently in different people. They tend, unfortunately, to be less effective in older people. So I think I wouldn't want people to assume that vaccines are going to make the virus disappear. That's unlikely. It's likely to be with us. What the vaccines will do is allow most people to either not become infected or to have a very low level of illness if they do become ill. The other thing that I think we do need to be alert for, because of the speed with which the vaccines were developed, is we should be very alert for any adverse events. It is often the case that products that are developed seem fine through the development process, but when they hit the real world with much larger populations using them, the issues can crop up. So the safety issues should be taken seriously. And finally, I wonder at least if we will, in my view, kind of come to our senses and return to a more traditional approach to epidemics, where we don't kind of in a lot of ways shut normal life down and inflict upon ourselves all the harms that may cause. So just a few slides now. This first one just kind of gives you a sense of the typical course of an infection in an individual. Kind of gives you a rough idea of when they may be infectious and how that might be reflected in a test. I mentioned that this epidemic is highly bifurcated, primarily by age. So the next few slides will kind of show that. This one, along the horizontal axis, you see the age groups, and on the vertical axis, you see cases. And you can see that cases, and this is just raw numbers, not population-based, but cases tend to be highest in the young, who, as I mentioned, tend to have the highest level of contacts. If you look at hospitalizations on this slide, you begin to see a very different pattern. The green is total hospitalizations, and you can see there that the hospitalizations grow as people age. And if you consider that the number of people in these older age groups is much smaller than the number in the smaller age groups, this is an even more exaggerated effect. And then this slide shows you deaths. And here you see very clearly the median age of deaths in Minnesota continues to be around the age of 85. The deaths are almost exclusively concentrated in the frail elderly. This shows hospitalization rates for cases. So if you took all the cases in a particular age group, what % of those cases are hospitalized? And again, if you look at the green line, which shows total hospitalizations, you can see that the rates are very low up to the age of around 40 or so. They begin to rise a little bit, but they don't really get significant till you get to that 60 plus age group. And then if you move on and look at the death case rate, what's the percentage of deaths out of the total cases? Here you see that there are basically no deaths as a function of cases until really, again, you get to that, maybe that 60 age group. But you also see that by the time you're getting into that 80 plus age group, the death, if you get infected, your likelihood of death is quite high. It's approaching 20%. Now this looks at the same kind of statistics, but on a population basis. So this is saying that, so for example, for people from that are under 10 years of age, let's assume there's 500,000 people in that category. What % of those on a population basis have been infected? And here again, you see that even on that population basis, the highest rates are in those lower age groups. But you don't see these 70 plus and 80 plus age groups have relatively small populations in them. But they also, because they have few contacts, have relatively low case rates. But now, if you take the same approach, but look at hospitalizations on a population basis, here you really see the extreme growth in hospitalization rates on a population basis as you look at the older groups. And when you look at deaths, you again can see that on a population basis, there is almost no death. These gradients on the y-axis are 0.1% of the population. So we're not even at 0.1% of the population until you get over that over the age of 60, and even in the 80% plus group, that rate, while it's getting substantially higher, is less than 1%. This analysis, and I'm actually working on a reanalysis of this as we speak. The most important parameter for an epidemic, I believe, is to understand the number of people who are infectious or active cases. These are the people who could pass the infection to someone else. To know what this number is and what the trend is kind of critical to understanding what's going on. You can see here, this is just raw case numbers, and you can see that started August 1st, and you can see that it stayed very stable for a long time. Then we get into the fall, begins to rise in October, and then toward the end of October and early November, it rises very sharply. You can see here that it actually pretty much peaked and plateaued early in November. My current analysis is extended for another week or more, and very clearly shows that this was the peak in active cases and they are heading down. This chart is a little different view that shows you the number change in active cases. And again, the sawtooth pattern here is due to weekends where there's much lower testing and much lower identification of cases. So it's kind of an artifact of testing. But if you look at this, you can kind of see the number kind of stays within a pretty narrow band. Then it starts to grow. And again, you can see that we were adding active cases at the peak at around 6,000 a day. That occurs around the end of the first week in November. And again, my more recent analysis will show very clearly how rapidly the daily change in number of cases is falling off. And this last chart just shows that by 1%. And this is what I think is really important to follow is what's the trend? How fast on a percentage basis are active cases growing, and how fast are they falling, and where is the trend? And again, here you can see that in early November, as is typical with these waves, we saw a rapid uprise. It lasted for a few weeks and then it rapidly falls off. And I think that's largely attributable to just natural kind of burnout. And then the last slide here, just when I talk about harms that are caused by the actions, these are this is CDC data. It comes, it's Minnesota specific, and it's the number of deaths above average that are not coronavirus deaths. And you see here that we have a large number of deaths. The Alzheimer and dementia category, that is people who are dying. The diagnosis is typically called failure to thrive because of isolation among this group that tends to already be isolated. We're seeing a rapid growth in deaths there above the average. People with cancer are missing screenings and treatments. People with high blood pressure are failing to go to the emergency room when they're having symptoms. The same is true with diabetes deaths and with heart disease. So just a way of showing that these actions have consequences that should be taken into account, not just what the effect of the virus is. And that's really the end of the presentation. Appreciate the opportunity to share this information. Thank you.
Kevin, so we've got some questions here. Kevin, I gave you a question about mask. If you could answer that first. If you want me to repeat it, I will, or if you got it, go ahead and state it.
I don't, where would I see that?
Sure, I'll read it to you.
Okay.
Given the upheaval the mask mandate has caused, between those who say just wear it and those opposed for any reason? Do we have enough data at this point to conclusively state what benefit the mask has?
This is like my least favorite topic because I think in a lot of ways it's just a digression from more important things. You have to think about masks in two ways. You have to think about what happens at an individual encounter level, and you have to think about what happens at a population level. At an individual encounter level, there's a significant amount of data of varying quality in terms of the types of experiments that are done about the ability of particles to either pass through the mask or be blocked by the mask, to go through gaps. It's pretty clear that at that individual encounter level, a properly worn mask should block a significant number of particles either going out from the wearer or coming into the wearer, and should prevent transmission. The problem becomes is that's not 100% effective. And what studies suggest is in real life conditions, when people are wearing masks, even if you assume that they're 70 or 80% effective in an individual encounter, across large numbers of encounters, which is the population reality, they don't seem to have an effect in stopping transmission. It doesn't mean people shouldn't wear them, but we should be realistic. And if you look at in Minnesota, for example, where mask wearing is over 90%, according to every survey that you can find, we still see this surge of cases. And if you compare mask wearing versus cases in various places, you don't see significant differences. So I think people should wear them, but people should not think that they're not a magic bullet. They're not stopping transmission in a lot of cases, and people should just be aware of that. I actually think maintaining distance is probably a lot more protective. And my personal rule is I don't go any place that is crowded with people I don't know, and therefore can't trust that they would be careful about not being around other people if they are infected. So that's kind of my big picture on masks. I do get concerned about the constant kind of, wear them and we won't have a problem attitude, because that's clearly not the case, and people need to be aware of that. They need to be aware that that is not going to necessarily protect you.
Margaret, do you want to read the next question from the post to Kevin?
Okay, I just too wanted to just mention, so we're at 8:29 right now, and a lot of people look forward to that hard stop at 8:30. I do want to offer, if Kevin is able to stay on and continue the conversation and answering the questions, please do. But I also just want to be thoughtful and courteous to others that may have to hop off and go on to their day. So just quick shout out for next week. We have Nick Erickson from Housing First Minnesota as a speaker. And I have some other updates. I'll be happy to share it. Wish I could share them right now, but I think this is really important to complete this conversation. And Kevin, thanks again for coming and speaking with us. This has just been a completely amazing presentation. And thank you for doing that. So, all right, so we'll go back to the questions, and let's see, Kevin. So thank you, everybody. And thank you especially to our guests. Sorry, we weren't able to pull you each in and introduce you. All right. So Paul Nelson had one. While we don't have the past data on this pandemic, it seems that we indeed have some data on past pandemics, Spanish flu, and there was a much larger, more serious second wave of that. We are currently seeing that in this pandemic. On the surface, it seems that we didn't learn very much from the learning event. Why is that?
Well, I think one thing to be reflective about is what our ability actually is to affect what happens. And I think it's, you just have to be realistic. This is a very infectious respiratory virus that is probably survives in the environment in ways that we don't completely understand, and that probably has an ability to be transmitted that we don't completely understand. I think if you look at the case waves, not just in this country, but everywhere, it's pretty apparent that realistically, there's probably limits to what can be done without really extreme actions that have consequences of their own. It's also important to recognize that because of the growth in testing, trying to compare the level of cases, for example, in this wave to either the summer wave in the South and Southwest or the original wave, which was primarily in the Northeast and to some extent in the Midwest, it is difficult. You need to, and I've worked on this and just haven't come up with a really satisfactory method. You need to find some way to normalize the cases versus testing. One thing you can kind of look at is hospitalizations, because regardless of testing, which may find a lot more asymptomatic and mild cases, the more serious cases that need hospitalization, you would think would be reflective of the level of seriousness, and the same with deaths. The actual rates of hospitalization and deaths are down significantly in this wave because we are doing so much more testing. We are doing at this point in Minnesota at least 10 times, maybe 20 times the amount of testing we were doing in the spring and early summer. So I think you just have to be you have to be careful to think about how do you compare different waves. The other thing that's pretty clear, at least in the upper Midwest, this wave has peaked. And it, interestingly, and I think it's because we have an international airport and we almost certainly got seeded much earlier in the metro area than some of our surrounding states did. So it peaked a couple of weeks earlier in places like the Dakotas and Wisconsin than here. But we also appear to have kind of come over the top of that curve and are likely on the downside. And if you believe the antibody prevalence survey data that's been released recently, and if you believe the CDC paper that was just released last week about their projections on the true level of infections, we have 20 to 25% of the population in Minnesota that's been infected. Those infections are occurring across people with the highest level of contacts. So if we went through those slides that show what happens in a population, when you take out the people with the most contacts, you're taking out more of the ability for the virus to transmit. So at that level of infections, transmission is just naturally going to slow significantly. And that's kind of what we're seeing at this point. And interestingly, if you look at the case curves in the Midwest, kind of starting in Missouri and moving north to the Dakotas, it's very interesting what the seasonal impact and the interaction with latitudinal location must be, because each case curve is a little lower as you move south. But again, that's some indication that, these cases, this virus has an ability to do what it's going to do. And I think we're very fortunate in a way that it's not a whole lot more lethal.
Okay, Kevin, if you have time for one more question.
I have all the time
Do you
people
have
want to
time?
ask questions.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. So Steve Lyon had a question, follow up on masks, and wondering if we were encouraged to wear a better mask, something closer to like the N95, would that be sufficient enough for us to feel a little bit more confident going out?
Most of the research would suggest that cloth masks are pretty ineffective. The typical surgical mask that you see people often wearing is better. N95s are really pretty good. Worn properly, probably stop 95% plus transmission. So yeah, the quality of the mask can make a difference. I have seen inconsistent research about face shields. There has been some research that has suggested that face shields may actually promote an airflow that can increase the risk of transmission. I have seen other research that suggests that face shields are more effective at obviously that is a physical barrier, at least in the front part of the face. But yeah, I think the quality of a mask, the type of mask, at least from the research I've seen, does make a difference.
Okay. If you have time for one last final. The University of Illinois has tested all students with saliva twice per week with results available in 6 hours. Is that a process that can be scaled for use in Minnesota?
It depends on the quality of the test, and people are just starting to do research comparing the adequacy of various types of tests. Some of the rapid tests, which are saliva-based, are pretty good, and some are not good. In any test performance, tests are validated in a laboratory type environment. True real world performance isn't likely to be as good. So what you worry about, and actually more of an issue with some of the rapid tests, has been the level of false negatives versus false positives. With PCR tests, false positives can be more of an issue, and especially low positives, which would typically reflect people who are not infectious. So here's my concern about testing in general. The purpose of testing should be to identify people who are truly infectious and to, encourage, if you live in China, to force you to isolate or quarantine for some period of time. We in Minnesota, and I think now the Department of Health recognizes this, when you go overboard on testing, you just overwhelm your capacity to actually contact trace, to identify like who's really infectious and who needs to isolate. The problem we have in the schools isn't really that there are a lot of cases of people who are infectious. We have a lot of people who haven't even been tested, but are told, well, so-and-so tested and was positive, so you all need to quarantine. And I think the CDC and other people are kind of working on that problem now and saying, okay, we need to come up with a better way to approach this problem. And maybe maybe the answer isn't test everybody every day. Maybe the answer is to go back to being a little more selective about how we test, and more thoughtful about our ability to actually follow up on the tests, and find other people who may have been exposed. So I think there are a lot of issues in this notion, which I've seen promoted, that will send everybody a test and everybody will wake up in the morning and do a daily test to find out if they're exposed or not. I just have to believe there has to be a better way.
Couple follow-up questions for the Rotary video. Tell me if I'm surmising what you believe correctly. Even with the use of masks, you think the seasonal changes is what's driving the spike, and that there was really short of everyone remaining isolated from everyone else, it was going to happen.
Yeah, I think that if you look at the case curves everywhere in the United States, it's very clear those curves look very much like what I refer to as an unmitigated epidemic curve. If you just looked at a classic curve of how an infectious agent would move through a population, the waves including this most recent wave in Minnesota, look like that curve, which suggests to me that mitigation efforts just don't make a difference. This is a highly infectious, highly transmissible virus that I believe we don't fully understand yet exactly all the ways it can be transmitted. And when it gets going, it just goes. And I think, unfortunately, there's not a lot we can do about it. Fortunately, it's not that lethal a pathogen.
Well, and not that lethal, and mostly it's not taking our youth, it's taking the elderly,
Yes.
which
Yes. Yeah, unlike influenza, which has
we would all go that route.
Yes, I think so. And influenza, by contrast, does cause a lot of deaths in children and young adults. So we're very fortunate that way.
One more question. Outside of the more hot topic areas about the shutdown schools and such, it appears that many corporations are going to forever change how they do office space, and many of them have not gone back to work yet. There may be some good well, I'm sure there will be some good that comes out of it, but many of the major corporations appear quite fearful of putting people back in office space, and there is some downside to not being together. Are they avoiding anything other than somewhat imaginary liability by not bringing people back to their offices?
Yeah, it's probably a bit of a complex topic, but I think what you suggested is probably correct, that the primary reason is the fear of liability to some extent, that they feel that it's best to kind of avoid a situation where employees may say, I got infected at work. I think if you look at the workplaces that are open, many of which aren't offices, but even if you look at relatively congested places like grocery stores, big box stores, we're seeing very little transmission of disease. So I suspect the reality is that if people took some basic precautions, people could be in offices. I know there are settings where people are in offices. So I'm not sure that the health reasons dictate that as much as fear of liability. And I think in the long run, there may be companies that find it to be a less costly way to operate. Although personally, as you suggested, I would wonder about the true kind of productivity and collaborative effects of not having people working in person at least a significant part of the time.
It may very well be people like me when I was younger who didn't have good work habits, wasn't highly conscientious, not being with a group of people,
Yeah.
but it felt pressure because they were succeeding. If I was at home, it wouldn't have been wouldn't have been a good thing for people. Now, maybe
Yeah.
there's not many people like me on the face of the earth.
Yeah.
I don't think that's true. I think there's a lot of.
I think companies are finding there's actually a lot of that, and it is an issue for companies to try and keep productivity at a level that it was before or that it needs to be at.
Exactly. Well, thank you again. I will get working on this and keep you up to date. But it'll be a few days. But we will get a link to you and to the 2 videos.
Okay, well, I really appreciate you doing this, and again, I appreciate the opportunity. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kevin.
All right, have a good day.
You too.